The sun burned low across the dry hills of Abilene when they brought her off the wagon. Cheeks flushed from heat and shame, her hands trembling but held high with whatever pride she had left. Eliza wasn't dainty, wasn't delicate like the other mail-order brides that stepped down before her. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and full in every way. Her dress stretched tighter than it should have been, but her chin didn't drop, not even when the first man laughed. "They said he wanted a wife, not a horse to haul freight," someone jeered, and the rest followed, the sound of their mockery kicking up louder than the dust at her boots. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just stepped off and looked for the man who'd written the letter, who'd said he didn't care about pretty or perfect, just that she be strong enough to love a place like this. But she didn't see him. Not yet. The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like prairie fire. And then he came. Ethan McCrae. Quiet rancher, known more for his cattle than his words. He stepped through the gawkers without a word, boots slow, hat low, until he stood in front of her. Tall, scarred across the temple, with eyes that didn't blink at her size or the red in her face. He looked her over once, then offered his hand. "You, Eliza?" She nodded, trying to keep the wobble from her voice. "I am." He nodded once, solid as the fence posts he drove daily. "Then you're home." Someone laughed again behind them, louder this time, and Eliza started to turn, ready to walk back to the wagon, maybe back to whatever lonely road would take her. But Ethan stopped her with 3 words. "You're my wife." She blinked. "Now?" "Now." He didn't look at the crowd, didn't raise his voice. He just stepped beside her, took her bag, and started walking toward his buckboard like there wasn't a dozen men still choking on their own laughter. Eliza followed, slower at first, then stronger. When she climbed into the seat beside him, he handed her a small ring. Nothing fancy, just silver and old. "Was my mother's," he said. "If you'll wear it." Her fingers shook as she slid it on. It wasn't a grand proposal, and it wasn't in a church. But it was quiet, true, and in front of the ones who'd laughed. And as they rode off, dust curling behind the wheels, Eliza let herself smile. Just a little. Because for the first time in years, someone had seen her and stayed. The wagon rolled steady along the dirt path that twisted through mesquite and stone, the sun setting behind them like a curtain drawn on the town's cruelty. Eliza sat beside Ethan, her back straight, hands clenched in her lap around the ring he'd given her, unsure if she should speak or stay silent. But Ethan didn't seem bothered by quiet. He just held the reins in one hand and drove like a man who'd always known where he was going. After a long while, he finally said, "You ride like someone who's left more than one place behind." She glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. "I have," she admitted. "Some by choice, some because I wasn't welcome." Ethan nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. His face carried the weight of someone who didn't ask many questions because he already had too many answers. They reached the ranch as darkness crept in. A modest spread tucked between rocky hills and open pasture, with a single barn and a house made of weathered planks but standing proud. "Ain't much," he said as he helped her down, "but it's honest, and it's yours now too." Eliza's boots hit the ground, and she felt something strange in her chest. Not dread, not fear, but the beginning of something softer. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old bread. The table was set with 2 chipped plates, and the fire already crackled in the hearth. He'd prepared it for her. "I ain't never done this before," he said gruffly as he set a tin of stew on the table. "I mean, marriage. Not with the paper, not with promises. But I figure if 2 people can sit at the same table and eat in peace, that's a start." Eliza took her seat slowly. The chair creaked under her, but it didn't collapse. Neither did she. As they ate, the wind pressed gentle against the shutters, like it too was listening. "You didn't have to say those things in town," she said after a long silence, "about me being your wife." Ethan looked at her then, his scar catching the firelight. "I don't say things I don't mean." The room held still after that. No laughter, no gawking stares, just a quiet man and a woman who'd been told she was too much of everything. But tonight, she was enough. After they cleared the table, Ethan handed her a quilt, nodded towards the spare room, and said, "You rest. Tomorrow's chores will be waiting." She stepped through the doorway, fingers brushing the doorframe, and thought, maybe this wasn't just a place to stay. Maybe it was the first place she'd be allowed to matter. The morning came in slow gold light, seeping through the curtain like a promise unspoken, and Eliza woke in a bed that didn't creak with judgment or lean with memory. She lay still for a moment, staring at the wooden beams above her head, listening to the distant sound of hooves in the barn and the faint clang of a pail against the well pump. Ethan was already up, already working, like the kind of man who didn't wait for thanks or ceremony. She rose quietly, washed her face in the basin near the window, and pulled on her dress from the day before, the only one she had that wasn't patched beyond dignity. When she stepped into the main room, the smell of coffee hit her like a warmth she didn't expect. Ethan stood at the stove, cracking eggs into a cast-iron skillet, his back to her. "Hope you're hungry," he said without turning. She paused, unsure how to carry herself in a house where kindness didn't wear suspicion like armor. "I can cook," she offered, "and mend and churn, if you've got cows." He glanced over his shoulder with a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "All right then, let's see what kind of cook this town laughed off their streets." She moved to the stove, hands finding confidence in motion. She fried the biscuits he'd started, added a pinch of salt to the beans, and when he tasted the finished plate, he gave her a small, satisfied nod. "Well, I'll be." That was all he said, but it was more than enough. After breakfast, they stepped outside into a world rimmed with sky and silence. The land stretched wide, uneven fences, thirsty soil, and 3 cows who looked at Eliza like they didn't trust strangers. Ethan handed her a bucket. "You said you churn. Let's test that." She knelt beside the smallest cow and got to work. Slow and steady, her movements remembered from another life on a failed farm, with a father who'd said she'd never find a man unless she lost weight or learned silence. She'd done neither, and yet here she was, milking a cow on a ranch with her ring finger glinting in the sun. Ethan repaired a fence nearby, his hammer tapping like a metronome in rhythm with her heartbeat. When she finished, she walked over and held up the full bucket. He took it, smiled faintly, and said, "Not bad." She smiled back, something soft blooming behind her ribs. Maybe it wasn't love, not yet, but it was work shared and silence respected, and that was more than any letter or promise had ever given her before. It was 2 days later when the women from town came, clattering up the dusty road in a borrowed wagon, their faces tight with curiosity and something sharper. Eliza saw them from the porch, hands still damp with flour from the dough she'd been kneading. Ethan was in the fields mending a busted water trough, too far to stop them if they'd come to mock. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood tall, watching them dismount in a rustle of lace and judgment. There were 3 of them: Mrs. Caro, whose husband ran the dry goods store, Ruth Templeton, the preacher's widow with eyes like needles, and young Mary June, barely 20, and already hard in the mouth. "We thought we'd check on the new bride," Mrs. Caro said, her voice stretched sweet and sour like syrup gone bad. Eliza nodded, blocking the doorway. "I'm here." Ruth's eyes scanned her from head to toe. "You're taller than I remembered. Broader, too." "That happens when you eat," Eliza said calmly, folding her arms. Mary June stifled a laugh, then tried to turn it into a cough. "Well," Ruth said, "some folks don't mind the untraditional types. Ethan always was strange that way." Eliza said nothing. She didn't need to. The women shifted, realizing their words weren't landing like they used to. "We brought some preserves," Mrs. Caro added, holding out a jar of peach jam like it might undo everything she'd just said. Eliza took it, nodded once, then asked, "Y'all want to come in?" "I've got bread in the oven." The offer stunned them. It wasn't kindness, it was control. Inside, she served them hot slices with butter and poured coffee without trembling. They talked about the drought, the cost of flour, and how the telegraph man had married someone from Kansas who wore red shoes. They didn't ask about her weight again. They didn't laugh. When Ethan returned and tipped his hat to the ladies, they all looked suddenly uncomfortable, as if being caught in his kitchen was something to apologize for. "We should go," Mrs. Caro said, rising too fast. "Yes," Ruth agreed. "Just wanted to be neighborly." Eliza walked them out, watched their wagon disappear down the trail, then turned back inside. Ethan didn't say a word, just nodded at the empty cups and jam jar. "Didn't run them off," he said finally. Eliza smiled, slow and wide. "Didn't have to." He reached for the last piece of bread, handed it to her instead. "You don't scare easy." She took a bite, still warm from the oven. "They'll learn." And deep in her chest, something braver than pride took root. She hadn't just married a man. She was building a life. The nights turned colder by the end of the week, the air sharp with the bite of early frost, and Eliza found herself reaching for the spare quilt in the chest at the foot of her bed. It was old, stitched from scraps that didn't match, but warm and heavy like memory. And as she unfolded it, a small note slipped from between the folds. Her breath caught. Just a scrap of paper, brittle at the edges, scrawled with a name she didn't know, and a date from years before. Someone had wrapped themselves in this same quilt once, in this same house, maybe waiting on a man who never came back or holding on to heat in the silence of grief. She traced the handwriting with her finger, then folded the note back into the seam where it had fallen. That night, she sat by the fire, needle in hand, patching the spots that had thinned with time. Ethan came in late, shoulders dusted with hay, boots muddy from the creek bank. He didn't speak much, just watched her for a moment as she stitched in the lamplight. "You sew," he said finally, not quite a question. "I make do," she replied, tugging the thread taut. "Winter's close." He nodded, pulled off his gloves, and joined her by the fire. They sat in silence a while, the warmth between them not just from the flames but from the small understanding that had grown like moss between stones. Slow, steady, soft. "That was my ma's quilt," he said after a long pause. "She stitched it through her last winter. Said she wanted it to hold all her best days." Eliza looked down at the uneven patches, suddenly more reverent. "It's beautiful." "She'd be glad it's still being used," he said. "Glad someone with steady hands had it now." The compliment landed gently, like snow on open ground, unexpected and quiet. Eliza nodded, finished her last stitch, and folded the quilt over her lap. The fire cracked and shifted. "You ever think about having children?" she asked, unsure why the question came then, in that moment. Ethan's jaw moved, but he didn't flinch. "I used to," he said. "Then life got in the way." "Would you still want to?" she asked, almost whispering. He looked at her, his eyes soft and serious. "With the right person, maybe. You?" She nodded slowly. "I think I'd be good at it. loving someone who needs it. He didn't say anything more, but he reached for her hand. Not bold, not rough, just steady. And in the firelight, beneath a quilt that had held another woman's best days, Eliza wondered if hers were just beginning. The wind came in hard from the north 3 days later, sweeping across the plains like a warning with no words, and by dusk, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. Ethan had seen it coming, muttered something about fence lines and lightning, then disappeared toward the lower pasture with his rifle and his dog. Eliza stayed behind, gathering buckets, bracing shutters, laying towels under the doors where the wind had already begun to seep. She moved with purpose, not panic, her breath steady even when the first crack of thunder split the sky in half. She had lived through storms before, emotional, social, and skyborne, but something about this one felt deeper, meaner, like it wasn't just weather, but a test. When the rain hit, it came sideways, slamming into the windows like fists, the roof groaning with every gust. She lit 2 lanterns, set one in the hallway, and sat at the kitchen table with her hands curled around the hot teapot she'd prepared just in time. But when the back door flew open with a bang, she jumped, heart hammering. And then Ethan was there, soaked to the bone, hat gone, face streaked with dirt and rain. "Tree came down on the far fence," he said, breathless. "Cattle scattered." Without hesitation, Eliza stood, grabbed the oilskin coat by the hook, and pulled it over her dress. "I'll help," she said. Ethan blinked, surprised. "It's rough out there." "I've walked through worse," she replied, already tying her boots. They moved together into the dark, her lantern slicing the storm like a blade of gold, his steps wide, sure, protective but not overbearing. In the pasture, the mud sucked at their feet, the cattle crying out like ghosts, and together they herded the beasts back through the broken fence, working without words, without complaint. Once, she slipped, fell hard, but before she could rise, Ethan's hand was there, pulling her up like it was nothing at all. When they finally returned to the house, drenched and shivering, Ethan didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked, as if seeing not just a wife, but a partner who hadn't flinched, hadn't hesitated, even when the night turned wild. "You all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "Number tonight, it was you who held the line." And as they stripped off the wet clothes and dried by the fire, Eliza realized something simple but profound. She wasn't just surviving here. She was becoming part of this land, part of this life, part of a man's world that had room for her strength and her storm. 2 weeks after the storm, when the skies had softened and the land had dried, Eliza found the trunk in the attic, hidden beneath a layer of dust thick as memory. It was old, cedar-lined, with rusted hinges that creaked like protest as she lifted the lid, revealing what looked like a wedding dress, carefully folded and yellowed with time. She touched the lace at the collar, delicate and hand-stitched, and ran her fingers down the sleeves as though it might speak to her. Tucked beside it was a hand mirror, the glass fogged at the edges, its silver frame engraved with initials she didn't recognize. For a long moment, Eliza simply sat on the wooden floor, dress pooled in her lap, staring into the cloudy reflection of a face she barely knew. Her own. The face of a woman who had been mocked, dismissed, forgotten, now here in a stranger's dress, in a house that was slowly becoming hers. She brought the dress downstairs, laid it across the quilt on her bed, and stood beside it, half afraid to try it on. When Ethan returned from checking the stock pond, his boots heavy with red clay, he stopped in the doorway and just looked. "Yours?" he asked. "No," she said, "but it feels like it should be." He stepped closer, ran a hand along the lace, then met her eyes. Try it on." She hesitated, but something in his voice made her believe she should. So she did, alone, in the room, behind the curtain. And when she stepped out, the dress hanging just right on her frame, Ethan didn't laugh or blink or look away. He smiled, quiet and true, and said, "Never seen it look better." She wanted to cry at that, not because of the compliment, but because it was said without pity, without hesitation. He meant it. "They wouldn't have said that in town," she whispered. "They would have said it didn't fit, that I didn't fit." "Then it's a good thing you're not in town," he said simply. She stood there in the dress for a long moment, letting herself feel beautiful. Not pretty or passable or not that bad, but simply beautiful. And when she took it off, she folded it carefully, with reverence, and placed it back in the trunk. Later that night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars break open across the sky, Ethan reached over and took her hand. "Next time someone calls you too much," he murmured, "you remember this day." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder, and thought maybe, just maybe, she'd been exactly enough all along. It was a Sunday afternoon when the wagon rolled back up the trail, creaking with the weight of men Eliza hadn't seen since the day she arrived. Faces red from drink and sun, voices loud before their boots even hit the dirt. The same men who'd laughed when she stepped off the stagecoach, the same ones who'd called her names that stuck longer than bruises. They came uninvited, 3 of them, led by Amos Griggs, the blacksmith's son, whose mouth always ran faster than his sense. Ethan was inside, cleaning his rifle, not in preparation, just habit. But when he heard the laughter outside, he stepped onto the porch, slow, deliberate, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Heard you got yourself a real woman now, McCrae," Amos called out, grinning as if the insult was clever. "Big enough to pull the plow and cook the stew at the same time." The others chuckled, but it faltered when Eliza stepped out behind Ethan, her arms folded, face unreadable. She didn't hide, didn't flinch. She stood tall beside her husband, the ring on her finger catching the light. "Didn't expect you to show your face again," she said calmly. Amos laughed again, but it cracked at the edges. "Just thought we'd see how married life's treating you, see if the walls could hold her." Ethan stepped down off the porch, slow and steady. "You done?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but the kind of quiet that warned thunder wasn't far behind. "Just saying what everybody thinks," Amos said, his eyes flicking nervously now between Eliza and the barn. "Woman like that don't belong out here." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't swing. He just said, "This land's hard. It doesn't care what size a woman is, only if she stays when things get rough." He looked over his shoulder at Eliza. "She stayed through storm and silence, fed my stock, sowed my fences, faced your laughter, and never once asked for more than a little piece." Amos opened his mouth, but no sound came. Ethan turned back to him. "You want to laugh at someone? Laugh at the man who never earned what he mocks." The silence that followed was longer than any sermon Eliza had ever sat through. The men shifted. One muttered something about needing to get back to town. They left without another word. When the dust from their wagon faded, Ethan walked back up the steps and looked at Eliza. "They'll think twice next time," he said. She nodded. "Let them think all they want. I've got more to do than chase ghosts." And with that, she stepped back into the house, not as a woman who'd been laughed at, but one who had outlived the laughter. The post-rider came just before sunset, his horse lathered and tired, and handed Ethan a small stack of letters before trotting off without a word. Most were bills or notices, but one envelope bore Eliza's name in an unfamiliar hand. Tight script, slanted like the writer had written it with shame or urgency. She stared at it for a long while before sitting at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering as she broke the seal with cautious fingers. Inside was a single page, folded once, written in the voice of someone she hadn't heard from in nearly a decade. Her sister. The words started stiff, formal. "I heard you married. I hope you're well," but softened quickly into apology. Stories of sickness and debt, of their parents passing, of a nephew Eliza didn't know existed. And then came the question that sat like stone at the bottom of the page. "I have nowhere else to go. Could I come to you?" Her first instinct was to fold the letter away and hide it deep in a drawer, maybe under the quilt she'd patched or in the attic trunk with the dress. Her sister had never stood up for her, had laughed when others did, had said, plainly and more than once, that Eliza was too big to ever be chosen. And yet, here she was, asking, not demanding, not pretending to be blameless, just asking. Ethan came in from the barn, boots heavy with dust, and noticed the look on her face. "Bad news?" he asked. She handed him the letter and watched him read, slow and steady, no change in his expression until the very end. He set it down and looked at her. "What do you want to do?" She hesitated. "Part of me wants to say no. Leave her to the same silence she left me in. And the other part? Thinks maybe this place could be more than just ours. Maybe it could be a second chance, for more than just me." Ethan nodded, thoughtful. "This land's got room. If she's willing to work, we'll find a way." Eliza folded the letter back up and stared at the flame of the candle. "I'll write her. No promises, but I'll write." That night, as she penned her reply, the words came easier than she expected. Not full of warmth, not yet, but not bitter either. Honest, fair. She didn't know what her sister would bring with her. Regret, resentment, redemption, but for the first time in years, Eliza felt like her voice mattered. And with that, she sent the letter eastward, not as the girl who had been mocked and dismissed, but as a woman who had survived and built something worth sharing. The morning her sister arrived, the air held that early spring stillness, the kind that made everything feel suspended between memory and promise. Eliza had risen before dawn, nerves quiet but constant, her hands moving through the old rituals, kneading bread, sweeping the floor, wiping the good plates with the edge of her apron. She didn't know if they'd speak easily or stumble through silences, if bitterness would walk in the door ahead of forgiveness. But she knew she wanted the table to look like it had room for grace. Ethan had mended the fence gate the day before, replacing a rusted hinge and brushing off the dust from the sign he'd carved himself. McCrae Ranch. Eliza had smiled when she saw it, not for the name, but for the fact he'd placed it out front for all to see. When the wagon crested the hill, her heart caught. There, seated beside a worn driver, was a woman who looked older than she remembered. Thinner, paler, but still holding herself like pride and shame were dueling in her spine. She stepped down carefully, eyes darting to the porch, to the sign, to Eliza. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Eliza stepped forward, not to embrace, but to nod. "You made it," she said simply. Her sister nodded back, lips tight. "I wasn't sure you'd let me." "I wasn't sure either," Eliza admitted. Behind her, Ethan appeared, hat in hand. "You must be Clara. I'm Ethan. We've got a room made up. You'll need to earn your keep, but there's work to go around." Clara glanced at him, startled by the directness, then nodded. "I can sew, and I'll cook, if that's needed." "It is," Eliza said, and with that, they led her inside. The first few days were cautious. Meals were quiet, tasks were shared but not discussed. But Clara never complained. She cleaned the stove without being asked, mended socks with small, neat stitches. And once, Eliza found her humming the same lullaby their mother used to sing when the wind howled through the roof beams. One night, as they sat by the fire, Clara whispered, "I was wrong. Back then. About everything." Eliza didn't look away from the flame. We both were. And that was all that needed to be said. The next morning, Eliza set 3 plates on the table. Ethan poured the coffee, Clara flipped the eggs, and something fragile but real settled in the room. Family, not by forgiveness alone, but by the choice to start again. Outside, the wind carried no laughter, no cruelty, only the sound of 3 people building something new, one quiet,